Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise today to recognize the urgent need for increased U.S. Coast Guard assets in the polar regions of the globe. America has been a world leader and a dominant force in the Arctic and Antarctic regions for over a century. While both of these areas are currently models of internationally shared territory, the geopolitical relevance of the polar regions is rising, and with it comes larger and stronger presence from American competitors such as Russia and China. Russia and China have both declared plans to grow and strengthen their presence in the polar region. China recently announced its status as a near-Arctic nation and continues to rapidly grow its ice-breaking fleet. Over the last 3 years, Russia has constructed 6 new bases in Russian Arctic territory. These are concerning and clear signs that Russia and China have intentions to change the nature of their presence in the polar regions. In order to compete with these countries, we must protect our sovereignty in the Arctic and our national interests in the Antarctic. It's time for Congress to reinvest in the Coast Guard and their assets in this area. The Coast Guard's sole heavy icebreaker, the Coast Guard cutter Polar Star, is 40 years old, and the task of accessing the polar region becomes more difficult for this ship every ice season. Immediate investments in new heavy icebreaker ships, the Polar Security Cutter Fleet, is critical to ensuring a long-term presence for the U.S. in these polar areas. The U.S. Coast Guard has created a 6-3-1 approach to rebuilding its polar region fleets. With this 6-3-1 position, the Coast Guard will build a fleet of 6 polar icebreakers, including 3 polar security cutters, similar to the Polar Star, and the U.S. Coast Guard's first polar security cutter. These new heavy icebreakers provide continued access to the polar region and ultimately will prevent the U.S. from ceding any ground to our political adversaries. I appreciate the hard work done by the folks at the Coast Guard, not only in the polar regions, but across the world. Their efforts play a role in ensuring our national security, and it is vital that we continue to provide the Coast Guard with the funding they need in order to do their jobs. This investment will arm the Coast Guard with the tools, equipment, and personnel it needs to complete its missions on the polar front. I urge my colleagues in Congress to join me in supporting the requested $750 million in funding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 5 minutes.